When I watched her walk out that door, heels clicking against the marble floor we'd picked out together, she didn't even look back. Just said, "You'll never be enough for me, Daniel." And then she was gone, my wife, my world, my mistake. She left me for a man named Richard Lawson, the kind of man who wore arrogance like a suit. Old money. Flashy car. The kind who thought everyone's value was printed on their paycheck. She told me he could give her the life she deserved. Funny thing is, I was the one who built that life for other people. I just never thought I'd have to build it for my enemy. At first, I broke. I won't lie. Nights were long, empty. I'd stare at the empty space on the bed and imagine her laughter echoing in someone else's home. But pain is a strange thing. It either drowns you, or it sculpts you. And I chose to let it sculpt me. I worked harder than I ever had. Every ounce of heartbreak became fuel. Every memory became a weapon. My small tech firm, the one she used to call a hobby, started to grow. Deals closed. Investors came. Within 3 years, I wasn't just back on my feet. I was standing higher than I'd ever stood before. One morning, I got a call from a venture group looking for a partnership. The name? Lawson Holdings. I laughed. The universe really does have a sense of humor. When I walked into that meeting, I almost didn't recognize her at first. She looked polished, yes. But emptier. The glow was gone. Her laughter, forced. Richard sat beside her, talking over everyone in the room, bragging about his success. I could see the cracks beneath his gold watch and perfect teeth. He didn't recognize me right away. Why would he? I was the man his money had erased. Until the presentation started. Until my name appeared on the screen. Daniel Cooper, CEO of Vortex Technologies. He froze. She did too. I smiled, not cruelly, not triumphantly. Just calm. The kind of calm that comes from knowing time had done the work for me. We went through the deal like professionals. He tried to sound confident, but his eyes darted, nervous. I could tell he knew. His company was in trouble, deep trouble. They needed my acquisition to survive. When the meeting ended, I extended my hand. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Lawson," I said smoothly. "I've heard a lot about you." He shook it, but his grip faltered. My wife, ex-wife, couldn't even meet my eyes. The next few weeks were pure poetry. My lawyers moved fast, my board approved faster. And within 2 months, Lawson Holdings was no longer his company. It was mine. I had bought it, piece by piece, through silence, patience, and precision. The day it became official, I visited the office he once ruled from. His nameplate was gone. My logo gleamed on the door. He sat across from me, pale, sweating. His empire was gone. "I just need time," he stammered. "We can rebuild." "Maybe you could," I cut him off. "Richard, you'll have plenty of time. I'm not firing you." He blinked, confused. "No," I continued. "You're staying on. But not as CEO. You'll report to me directly. Think of it as humility training." The look in his eyes was priceless. But it wasn't anger that filled me. It wasn't even triumph. It was closure. Quiet, sharp closure. As I left the office, I saw her, standing by the elevator, clutching her purse like it was the last thing she had left. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You planned this, didn't you?" I looked at her for a long moment. "No," I said. "Life did. I just stopped getting in its way." She tried to speak again, but the elevator doors closed between us, just like the chapter of my life she'd chosen to end. Months passed. Richard faded into mediocrity, working under the same man he'd once mocked. My ex-wife tried reaching out, messages, calls, all unanswered. Eventually, she disappeared from the headlines, from the city, from everything. And me? I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I just stood in my office one night, looking out over the skyline, the same one I used to dream of conquering. I'd built everything back from nothing. But more than that, I'd built myself. Revenge wasn't sweet. It wasn't fiery. It was silent. Cold. Clean. And that's what made it perfect. Because sometimes, you don't destroy people by fighting them. You destroy them by becoming everything they said you couldn't be, and letting them watch. A few months later, the world had already moved on, but I hadn't, not completely. Success has a way of keeping you company, but it never keeps you warm. The nights were quieter, the apartment larger, and sometimes, when the city lights flickered against the glass, I found myself thinking of her. Not with longing, but with a strange, tired pity. One evening, as I was leaving the office, I noticed someone waiting by the lobby doors. It was her. She looked older, not in years, but in spirit. The designer dress, the makeup, the polished image, none of it could hide the truth in her eyes. Regret. "Daniel," she said softly. "I didn't know where else to go." Her voice trembled. "He left me. Took everything. Said it was my fault. I don't even have a place to stay." For a moment, I just stood there. Years of memory passed through my mind, her laughter, her betrayal, that door closing behind her. I took a slow breath. "You made your choice," I said quietly. "You wanted a man who could give you everything. You just didn't ask what it would cost." Tears welled in her eyes. "I was stupid. I know that now. I thought money meant safety. I thought love was comfort. But I was wrong about everything." She looked at me, searching for something, forgiveness, maybe. A lifeline. "I don't want money," she whispered. "I just want to feel human again." And for the first time, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel the need to hurt her or to make her suffer. I just felt done. Like the fire that had burned in me for years had finally gone out. "Then start by forgiving yourself," I said softly. "That's the only way you'll ever be human again." I reached into my pocket, pulled out a card, and handed it to her. It wasn't a check, or an address. Just a contact for a nonprofit I supported, a women's rehabilitation and counseling program I'd funded quietly for years. Her hands shook as she took it. "You're really not going to take me back, are you?" I smiled faintly. "No. Because the man you left doesn't exist anymore." I walked away without looking back. Not out of cruelty, but because for the first time, there was nothing left to look back at. A few weeks later, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that she'd taken the help, found a job, and started rebuilding her life. That was enough for me. As for Richard, he didn't last long. Working under me broke him faster than I expected. His arrogance turned to bitterness, his confidence to dust. He quit without notice, tried to start another company, and failed miserably. Last I heard, he was living in a smaller city, forgotten by everyone who used to care about his name. One night, I sat in my penthouse, the city glowing below. The silence wasn't lonely anymore. It was peaceful. I realized that revenge had never been about hurting them. It had been about healing me. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, walked to the window, and whispered, almost to the night itself, "You were right, after all." Because she was. I wasn't enough for her back then. But now, I was more than she could ever imagine. And that, I realized, was the truest revenge of all, not in taking back what was lost, but in becoming so much more than what was left. I turned off the lights, the city fading into a quiet hum, and smiled to myself. Some stories don't end in fire. some end in peace. And that's how you know you've truly won. Weeks passed, and the dust of the past finally began to settle. My company was thriving, my name carried weight in rooms where it once meant nothing, and yet, I carried none of the arrogance that used to define people like Richard. Success, I learned, isn't loud. It doesn't need to announce itself. It just is. I'd found a rhythm: long hours, quiet dinners, early mornings at the gym. No drama, no ghosts. But fate, it seems, doesn't like to end a story cleanly. One Friday afternoon, my assistant buzzed through my office intercom. "Mr. Cooper," she said, "there's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent." I frowned. "Who?" A pause. "Mr. Lawson." The name hit the air like an echo from another life. When he walked in, I barely recognized him. The man who once dripped with confidence and luxury now looked hollow. His tailored suits had been replaced by something wrinkled, his eyes sunken, his posture broken. He sat down across from me without being invited, hands shaking slightly. "I need help," he said simply. I studied him for a moment. The man who had taken my wife, flaunted his wealth, mocked my ambitions, now sat across from me, stripped of everything. "What happened?" I asked evenly. "Bad investments," he muttered. "One wrong deal led to another. The board turned against me. I lost everything." He looked up at me, and there was no arrogance left. Just desperation. "I know I don't deserve your help, Daniel," he said, his voice cracking. "But you're the only one who understands what it's like to lose everything. Please." For a long time, I didn't speak. I just stared at the man who once took pleasure in my pain. Then, finally, I said, "You're right. I do know what it's like. But the difference is, I built myself back without destroying someone else." He swallowed hard, shame flickering across his face. "You're a better man than I ever was." I leaned forward, clasping my hands together. Maybe. Or maybe I just learned that revenge and forgiveness aren't opposites. They're steps in the same direction. He frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means I already got my revenge the day I stopped caring about beating you." He sat in silence, tears threatening at the edges of his pride. "I can't give you money," I said finally. "But I'll give you advice, the kind I wish someone had given me when I was broken. Start over. Don't chase what you lost. Build what you've never had, peace." He nodded slowly, stood, and said nothing more. When he left, I watched him disappear down the hallway, the last ghost of my past finally walking out of my life. That night, I went for a drive, no destination, just the hum of the engine and the rhythm of rain on the windshield. I found myself passing by the cafe where I'd first met my ex-wife years ago. The lights were still on. A young couple sat inside, laughing, holding hands, the way we once did before everything fell apart. I didn't feel bitterness. Just a quiet acceptance that some chapters are meant to end. As I sat there, the rain tapping softly on the glass, I realized something simple but profound. Revenge had given me closure, but forgiveness had given me freedom. And maybe that's the final lesson, that true power isn't found in what we take from others, but in what we choose to release. When I drove away, the city lights reflected in my rearview mirror like 1,000 fading memories. And for the first time in years, I wasn't haunted by any of them. I'd won. Not over them, but over the man I used to be. And as the night swallowed the road ahead, I smiled, whispering to myself, some endings aren't revenge. They're rebirth. The next morning, sunlight poured through my windows like a quiet blessing. For the first time in years, I didn't wake up with that heavy feeling in my chest, the one that comes from unfinished wars and unspoken words. It was calm. Still. I made coffee, sat by the window, and watched the city wake. Horns honking, people rushing, life moving forward, just as it always does. But now, I felt part of it again. Not a man standing outside his own story, watching it unfold, but someone writing a new one. Later that week, my company hosted a charity gala, the same annual event I'd once dreaded attending because she used to be the one who planned it. This time, though, I went alone, without a trace of sadness. When I stepped on stage to speak about rebuilding lives, I meant every word. I looked out at hundreds of faces, some I knew, some I didn't, and I realized something important. Everything I'd lost had been replaced by something stronger, something real. After my speech, a woman approached me. She was one of the coordinators from the nonprofit I'd connected my ex-wife with months ago. "Mr. Cooper," she said with a warm smile, "you may want to know, she's been volunteering full-time. Helping other women start over. She talks about how you gave her a second chance." I didn't know how to feel. Pride? Sadness? Maybe both. But what I did feel, deeply, was peace. Because even if we could never go back, we had both finally moved forward, just in different directions. When the gala ended, I walked out onto the balcony overlooking the river. The night breeze carried the faint sounds of laughter and music from inside. I took a deep breath and whispered to myself, "It's over." But this time, those words weren't bitter. They were freeing. As I leaned on the railing, a thought crossed my mind: how strange it is that sometimes, losing everything is what it takes to find yourself. I'd lost a wife, a home, a life I thought was perfect. But in the ashes, I'd found something purer. Integrity. Strength. A kind of quiet power that didn't need to shout to be felt. A phone buzzed in my pocket, a text from my assistant. "Great job tonight, boss. Proud to work for you." I smiled. It wasn't much, but it meant more than she knew. When I left the venue, I walked through the city streets, the neon reflections rippling in puddles along the pavement. Somewhere out there, I imagined she was rebuilding her life too, maybe not happy yet, but trying. And for once, that was enough for me. I had no desire to look back anymore. No need to measure my success against someone else's downfall. Because the truth is, revenge, in its purest form, isn't about destroying the person who hurt you. It's about creating a life so complete, so grounded, that their absence no longer leaves a wound. As I reached my car, I looked up at the skyline, tall, bright, untouchable, and whispered the last words I would ever say to that old version of myself: "Thank you for breaking." Because without that pain, I never would have rebuilt. And as the city lights blurred behind me, the night stretching open like a new beginning, I knew the story had finally ended, not with anger, not with regret, but with peace. The kind of peace that comes only after the storm. Months passed, and life began to move with a steady rhythm. No more ghosts from the past, no more hollow victories. Just work, quiet evenings, and a growing sense of balance I hadn't known in years. Then one spring morning, as the cherry blossoms lined the park across from my office, I ran into someone I didn't expect to see again, her. She was sitting alone on a bench, coffee in hand, looking out at the trees. Her hair had grown longer, streaked with silver, and though her beauty was still there, it had softened, no longer something to be flaunted, but something earned. For a moment, I considered walking away. The past didn't need revisiting. But something in me, maybe the part that had once loved her, told me to stay. "Mind if I sit?" I asked quietly. She looked up, startled, then smiled faintly. "Of course." We sat in silence for a while. No tension, no sharp edges. Just two people breathing in the same morning air, both carrying their own versions of the same story. "I've seen your name in the news," she said finally. "You've done well for yourself." "I've been lucky," I replied. "And stubborn." She laughed softly, a sound that once would have undone me, but now felt like a distant song from another lifetime. "I wanted to thank you," she said after a moment. "Not just for helping me when I didn't deserve it, but for letting me go." It took me a long time to understand that you didn't hate me. You just stopped needing to. I looked at her, the weight of her words settling like dust on glass, visible, but no longer heavy. I didn't stop needing you, I said. I just learned to need myself more. Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled. That's the kind of love I wish I'd known how to give back then. I nodded. We all learned too late. The wind picked up, scattering petals across the path. She stood, straightened her coat, and said, "Goodbye, Daniel." "Goodbye, Emily," I answered softly. And just like that, she walked away, not out of anger, not out of guilt, but with quiet acceptance. The kind that comes when two people finally understand that their chapter ended long ago, and that's okay. I stayed there a while, watching her silhouette fade into the crowd. For a moment, the past felt close enough to touch, but when I reached for it, it slipped through my fingers like sunlight through mist. As I stood to leave, I realized I wasn't walking away from her anymore. I was walking toward something, a life that didn't need revenge or closure to be complete. By the time I reached my office, the noise of the city had returned, phones ringing, doors closing, voices blending into the hum of the day. It felt alive again, full of promise. That night, as I stood by my window overlooking the skyline, I poured one last glass of whiskey, not as a toast to victory, but as a quiet farewell to the man I used to be. I raised it to the reflection in the glass, older, wiser, a little scarred but unbroken. "To peace," I whispered. Because after everything, the betrayal, the revenge, the forgiveness, that was the one thing I'd finally earned. And as the city glowed beneath me, I knew, the best revenge isn't success. It's serenity. And I had it at last. The years rolled by quietly after that day in the park. I didn't see Emily again, and strangely, I never felt the need to. Our paths had crossed one final time to close a chapter that had haunted both of us for far too long. My life found a kind of stillness, not the kind that comes from loneliness, but the kind that grows from contentment. My business continued to thrive, though I'd stopped measuring my worth by quarterly profits or press headlines. The board once asked me during a meeting what my next big goal was. I simply said, peace of mind. They laughed, thinking I was joking. I wasn't. I'd begun mentoring young entrepreneurs, not the ruthless, money-hungry types, but the ones who still had light in their eyes, who wanted to build something rather than just own it. Watching them stumble, learn, and rise again reminded me of who I once was. And who I never wanted to be again. On weekends, I'd drive to the countryside. A small cabin, a porch, a pot of coffee, and silence, that was my version of heaven. Sometimes, I'd bring a book. Sometimes, I'd bring nothing at all. I'd just sit there and let the wind move through the trees, the sound of it whispering something I'd long forgotten how to hear, peace. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I got a letter. Not an email, not a text, an actual letter. The handwriting was familiar, even after all these years. Emily. It was short. Simple. Daniel, I wanted you to know that I'm doing well. I work full-time now with the foundation you helped build. I've found meaning again, not in wealth or comfort, but in helping others rebuild what they've lost. You were right about everything. About what matters. I hope you found happiness too. Thank you, for everything. Emily. I sat there for a long time, staring at those words. And then, for reasons I can't quite explain, I smiled. Because in some quiet, cosmic way, it felt like the story had finally come full circle. I didn't write back. Not because I didn't care, but because some things are better left complete. We had both rebuilt our lives from the ruins of what we destroyed together. That was enough. Years later, when I finally decided to retire, I stood one last time at the office window, looking out at the city that had seen every version of me, the dreamer, the fool, the broken man, and now, the one who had finally learned to let go. A young employee knocked on my door. "Mr. Cooper," she said shyly, "will you really be leaving us?" I smiled. "No one really leaves. They just stop showing up every morning." She laughed, not fully understanding. I didn't expect her to. When I walked out of that building for the last time, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The ghosts were gone, and the man who once lived for revenge had finally learned to live for peace. That night, I returned to my cabin, lit a fire, and sat on the porch with a glass of wine. The stars shimmered above, quiet, distant, eternal. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was waiting for anything. Not justice, not closure, not even love. Just peace. The wind carried through the trees, cool and calm, and I whispered to no one in particular, "Some stories end in revenge. Mine ended in freedom." And with that, I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the quiet take over, not as an ending, but as the kind of silence that means you've finally said everything that needed to be said. The night deepened, and the world outside my cabin sank into a soft, silver stillness. The only sound was the crackle of the fireplace and the distant song of crickets. It was the kind of quiet that most people would call lonely, but to me, it felt like a reward. I thought about how far I'd come. From the man who once chased validation, who measured love by what he could provide and success by how others saw him, to the man I'd become, content, unhurried, untethered. It had taken betrayal, humiliation, and heartbreak to strip me bare enough to rebuild from something real. I looked at the firelight dancing on the walls and murmured to myself, "Funny how pain can be the best teacher." In the months that followed, I started writing. Nothing public, just journals, notes, reflections. Stories of lessons learned the hard way, of mistakes that turned into blessings. At first, it was just a habit. But the more I wrote, the more I realized I was chronicling something deeper, a life rebuilt from ruin. One day, my assistant, who still helped me remotely from time to time, found one of the drafts. She read it quietly and said, "You should publish this." I laughed. "Who'd want to read the ramblings of an old fool?" She smiled. "People who think revenge is the answer." Her words stuck with me. So I did it. I turned my notes into a memoir, not about betrayal or wealth, but about transformation. I titled it, "The Fire That Forged Me." It wasn't a bestseller. It didn't make headlines. But that wasn't the point. What mattered were the letters I began to receive from people, men and women who'd gone through heartbreak, betrayal, or loss, and found strength in those pages. Some said the story gave them courage to start over. Others said it helped them forgive. That was enough. A few years later, I was invited to speak at a small university lecture on resilience and business ethics. I almost turned it down. Public speaking was never my thing, but something told me to go. After my talk, as the students gathered around, one of them, a young man, maybe in his early 20s, asked me, "Mr. Cooper, do you believe in second chances?" I smiled. "I believe in earning them." He nodded thoughtfully, and for a second, I saw a reflection of my younger self in him, ambitious, restless, still learning that failure isn't an ending, just a detour. That evening, as I walked back through the campus, I felt something warm in my chest. It wasn't pride. It was gratitude. Because life, in all its cruelty and grace, had given me exactly what I needed, the chance to become someone I could finally respect. When I returned to my cabin that night, the stars were brighter than usual. I sat by the window, journal open, pen in hand, and wrote the last line of my book sequel, a thought that had lived in me for years but only now found its way to paper. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It redeems it. I put the pen down, leaned back, and smiled. The fire had burned long ago. The ashes had settled. And in their place, something new had grown, quiet, steady, alive. Not revenge. Not triumph. Just peace. And maybe that's how every real story should end, not with fireworks or applause, but with the gentle sound of a heart finally at rest. As the night drifted toward dawn, I whispered one last thought to the silence around me. I didn't win because I destroyed them. I won because I rebuilt myself. And in that moment, I knew, truly and finally, that my story had reached its final page. The dawn arrived softly, slipping between the curtains in gentle streaks of gold. The world felt light, almost reborn. I sat on the porch of that quiet cabin, coffee steaming in my hands, and listened to the stillness before the day began, that sacred pause between night and morning when everything feels possible again. Life had slowed into something beautiful. My company ran itself now, handled by people I trusted, people who worked not out of greed, but because they believed in what we'd built. The empire that once fueled my ego had become a vessel for something greater, purpose. I spent more time teaching, mentoring, and speaking with those who thought success would fill the void in their hearts. I'd tell them gently, it won't. You can't buy peace. You can only earn it by losing everything that was never real. Most of them didn't understand, not at first. But a few did. And those few made it worthwhile. Years slipped by quietly. I didn't count them, I just lived them. Sometimes I thought of Emily, not with pain, not even with nostalgia, but with a strange kind of gratitude. She had been both my downfall and my catalyst. Without her betrayal, I would never have found myself. One winter morning, as I was sorting through old papers, I came across a small box. Inside were photographs, some from our wedding, some from those early years when love still felt simple. I stared at one in particular, her laughing in the sunlight, hair tousled, eyes full of innocence. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize her. Or the man beside her. He looked younger, softer, a man who believed the world would always be kind. I felt no bitterness toward him, only affection. Because that naive version of me, for all his faults, had the courage to love completely. I placed the photo back in the box and whispered, "Thank you." That evening, as the snow began to fall, I lit the fireplace and sat in my favorite chair. The flames flickered softly, and I realized something profound. Life isn't about what you gain or lose, it's about what you understand along the way. The pain, the betrayal, the revenge, the forgiveness, all of it had been necessary to bring me here, to this quiet, peaceful ending. A knock came at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, I found a young woman standing there, wrapped in a thick coat, her eyes bright and kind. "Mr. Cooper?" she asked. "I'm sorry to bother you. I work with the foundation. I was told to deliver this personally." She handed me an envelope and smiled before turning to leave. Inside was a letter, from Emily's attorney. My heart paused for a moment before I began to read. "Mr. Cooper, this letter comes to you per Emily Lawson's final wishes. She passed away peacefully last month. She wanted you to know that her final years were happy, spent helping others. In her will, she requested that her remaining estate be donated to your foundation, in your name. She said, tell him I finally understand." I sat there for a long time, the letter trembling slightly in my hand. The firelight blurred through the tears I hadn't expected to fall. After a while, I folded the paper neatly and placed it by the window. Outside, the snow kept falling, slow, steady, endless. I didn't cry out of sadness. I cried because somehow, in the end, life had come full circle. The hurt had turned into healing, the betrayal into redemption. She had found peace. And so had I. I poured a glass of wine, raised it toward the window where the snowflakes glowed against the light, and whispered, "Goodbye, Emily. Thank you, for the lesson." The fire burned low, and I leaned back in my chair, eyes heavy but heart light. Somewhere deep inside, I felt the final page turn. And as the night wrapped itself around me, I smiled, not as a man who had conquered or avenged, but as one who had finally made peace with every version of himself. Because in the end, that's all that's left. Not revenge. Not regret. Just peace. The kind that doesn't need an ending. The snow fell for hours that night, a quiet white curtain drawing itself over the years behind me. I sat there by the fire, watching the flakes spiral down into the dark, each one vanishing softly into the earth like a memory finding its place. I didn't move for a long while. The letter lay open beside me, the ink glinting in the flicker of the flames. Emily's words echoed faintly in my mind, "Tell him I finally understand." For so many years, I'd wanted her to understand. I'd wanted her to feel what I'd felt, the sting of betrayal, the hollow silence of nights spent questioning your worth, the fire of anger that refuses to die. But now that she finally did, all I felt was stillness. I whispered, "It's enough." In the following days, I arranged for the donation she'd left behind to go directly to the Women's Center, the same one where she had rebuilt herself. I made sure her name was included in the Foundation's new program, the Lawson Initiative, a mentorship project for those starting over after losing everything. It felt right. It felt like closure without the bitterness. A few months later, they invited me to speak at the opening. I almost said no, but something in me knew it wasn't about me anymore, it was about her legacy, and the strange way our stories had intertwined until the end. When I stood at the podium, I looked out over the crowd, faces of women and men, some scarred by life but still standing, still fighting. I thought of her, of me, of everything that had brought us to this quiet redemption. She once told me, I said softly, that money could buy happiness. She wasn't wrong, it just took us both a lifetime to realize the only thing worth buying is peace. And it isn't paid for in dollars. It's paid for in forgiveness. There was a long silence, the kind that doesn't need applause. And in that silence, I felt her there. Not as a ghost, but as a memory that had finally learned how to rest. After the event, I walked through the city, the same streets where I'd once chased success like it was oxygen. Now, every building, every flicker of neon light, felt like an old friend. The world hadn't changed, I had. When I reached the river, I stopped at the railing and looked at the skyline reflected in the water. The city lights shimmered like broken glass, beautiful, imperfect, real. I smiled and said quietly, "We did all right, didn't we?" A breeze stirred, brushing past like an answer. That night, back in the cabin, I wrote one final entry in my journal. It wasn't about revenge, or loss, or even love. It was about acceptance, that quiet grace that comes when you finally stop fighting the past. Life will break you, rebuild you, and humble you, often in ways you'll never understand. But if you let it, it will also forgive you. The trick is to forgive yourself first. I closed the journal, placed it on the table, and looked into the dying fire. Outside, the snow had stopped. The moon hung low over the woods, painting everything in a soft, silver calm. For a moment, I thought of all the lives we touch without ever realizing it, all the ripples our choices create. And I knew, somewhere out there, she had made her peace too. The fire crackled one last time before settling into embers. I leaned back, the warmth wrapping around me like an old, kind friend. My story, our story, had started with betrayal and ended with forgiveness. And that, I realized as my eyes grew heavy, was the truest revenge of all, to live long enough to turn pain into grace. As the night faded into quiet, I whispered one last truth to the world, a truth I'd earned, not through victory, but through understanding. In the end, peace isn't given. It's built, one forgiven moment at a time. And with that, I closed my eyes. The fire dimmed. And the story finally rested. The night lingered, but not with darkness, only with quiet. The kind of quiet that carries no sorrow, no weight. The fire had burned down to its last glowing coals, and the air smelled faintly of cedar and memory. I sat there, feeling the rhythm of my own heartbeat, steady and unhurried, and I realized that for the first time in decades, I was exactly where I was meant to be. When morning came, I stepped outside to find the world blanketed in snow. Everything, the trees, the porch, the road leading down the hill, was wrapped in pure white silence. It was as if life itself had been reset, cleansed of noise and pain. I drew a long breath, the cold air biting against my lungs, and smiled. I thought about the strange journey that had brought me here. How a broken heart had once turned me into a man obsessed with revenge. How success had dulled the ache but never healed it. How forgiveness, the thing I'd once seen as weakness, had been the only thing strong enough to set me free. It wasn't a cinematic ending. There was no dramatic music, no grand gesture. Just peace. And maybe that's how real stories end, not with noise, but with understanding. As I walked through the snow, I passed the old oak by the fence line, the one that had stood there since I bought the cabin. Its branches bent under the weight of the snow but didn't break. I reached out and brushed some of the frost from the bark, murmuring, "Still standing, huh?" In that moment, it hit me, that tree and I weren't so different. Bent, weathered, scarred by the storms, but still here. Still reaching for light. Later that day, I drove into town. I visited the local cafe, the one where everyone knew each other's names, where laughter always lingered near the windows. The waitress, Sarah, smiled when she saw me. "Haven't seen you in weeks, Mr. Cooper," she said. "Been busy living," I answered with a small grin. She laughed. "Well, whatever you're doing, keep at it. You look lighter." Lighter. That was exactly it. The burden that had lived in my chest for years had finally lifted, replaced by something gentler, quieter. After lunch, I left a larger tip than usual, old habits die hard, and took a walk through the town square. The local bookstore had a small display by the window. My book, The Fire That Forged Me, sat on the shelf beside newer titles. A little worn, a little faded, but still there. It made me smile. I didn't go inside. I didn't need to. On the drive home, I turned off the radio and let the hum of the tires fill the silence. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the snow in soft shades of gold and amber. I thought of Emily one last time, not with pain, but with gratitude. We had both learned, both grown, both made peace in the end. By the time I reached the cabin, the world was already slipping into twilight. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the fire again, not because I needed warmth, but because I loved the sound of it, the heartbeat of a quiet life. I opened my journal one final time and wrote just 6 words, "Peace found. Story told. Life continues." Then I closed the book and placed it beside the letter she'd left me. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faintest sound of something like laughter, or maybe just memory. I didn't chase it. I didn't need to. Because my story, for once, didn't need a next chapter. It had ended exactly as it should, not in revenge, not in regret, but in grace. And as the stars rose one by one above the snow-covered hills, I leaned back in my chair, eyes half closed, and let the warmth of the fire fade into the rhythm of the night. The world moved on. And so did I. The fire flickered softly, tracing shadows along the wooden walls of the cabin as if the house itself remembered every word, every silence, every sigh that had passed within it. I sat there, listening to the soft pop of the embers, and realized that the quiet didn't feel empty anymore. It felt earned. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. Habit, I suppose. The air was cold and crisp, and the horizon glowed faintly with that pre-dawn blue that promises both stillness and renewal. I brewed my coffee, black and simple, then stepped outside. The world was silent except for the distant caw of a crow and the crunch of snow beneath my boots. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something to happen. I wasn't haunted by what I'd lost or driven by what I wanted to prove. I was just here. Alive. When I looked back toward the cabin, the windows reflected the faint orange of the rising sun. That light, warm and fragile, reached across the snow until it touched my face. I stood there, feeling it, eyes closed, breathing deep. I thought of all the people who had drifted through my life, those who had stayed, those who had hurt me, those I had hurt in return. Every one of them had left a mark, a lesson, a scar. But they had also shaped the man standing here now. Not broken. Not bitter. Whole. Later that day, I drove down to the construction site of the new community center. The crew was already there, hard at work. The sound of hammers and engines filled the cold air. It was a project I'd started quietly, the Lawson Foundation's New Hope Center, a place for people to rebuild, just like I had. One of the younger workers, maybe 25, approached me with a grin. "Mr. Lawson, we'll have the first floor framed by next week. You really think people will come all the way out here?" I smiled. "They'll come," I said. "Not because it's easy. Because it's quiet. And quiet is where people find themselves again." He nodded thoughtfully before walking off. I watched him go, realizing how strange it felt to be the man others turned to for direction. Once, I had been the one stumbling in the dark. Now I was the one holding the lantern. That night, I sat at the old desk in the corner of the cabin. The moonlight spilled across the papers scattered before me, blueprints, letters, lists, a life rebuilt piece by piece. I began writing again. Not for money, not for fame, but because I had something to say. The new book's title came easily: Forgiveness is the Final Victory. Each page carried a truth I'd earned the hard way, that revenge burns bright but forgiveness endures, that power built on hate is fragile, but peace built on truth is unbreakable. When I finally closed the notebook, the moon was high and full. I leaned back, looking out the window, and whispered to no one in particular, she'd have liked this ending. The wind rustled the trees outside, soft, approving. I stayed there until the first light of dawn touched the horizon again. In that quiet moment, I knew that some stories don't really end. They just fade into other stories, quieter ones, wiser ones. And maybe that's all life is, a series of endings that teach us how to begin again. So I stood, placed another log on the fire, and smiled. Because for the first time in a long, long while, I wasn't the man who'd been betrayed. I wasn't the man who took revenge. I was the man who'd found peace, and built something lasting from the ashes. Outside, the world waited, calm, endless, alive. And as I stepped into the morning light, I whispered one final thought, the kind that only comes after every wound has finally healed. Some people spend their lives seeking justice. Others learn that peace is the better revenge. The wind outside had quieted by the time I returned to my chair. The fire had burned low again, only a few orange threads glowing in the ash, but that was enough. I watched them dance lazily in the dark, my hands folded loosely in my lap. For the first time in my life, there was nothing left to chase, nothing left to prove. Just a deep, honest calm. I had lost everything once, my wife, my pride, my faith in people, and in the wreckage, I thought revenge was the only way to feel whole again. But what I learned, painfully and slowly, is that revenge only gives you silence, not peace. Peace has to be built, choice by choice, apology by apology, even when no one asks for it. Emily had found her redemption in the end. So had I. And the man I used to be, angry, desperate, consumed by what was taken from him, no longer lived here. In his place was someone quieter. Stronger. Content to let the past rest exactly where it belonged. Outside, the first light of dawn crept through the window, brushing over the walls and the old oak floors. I smiled faintly as the world woke up again. I poured myself one last cup of coffee, walked out onto the porch, and looked at the stretch of land before me, the same land that had once been my escape, and now, my home. The frost sparkled under the sun, and the horizon glowed golden, endless. I took a sip and whispered softly to the morning air, "It's done." And it was. The pain, The anger. The revenge. All of it had finally settled into memory, sharp in places, but no longer bleeding. Because in the end, I hadn't just reclaimed my life. I had rebuilt it. Not with wealth. Not with vengeance. But with peace. And as the light spread wider, warming the cold world awake, I knew one thing for certain: the greatest revenge isn't power, or pride, or victory. It's the quiet satisfaction of moving on while the past stays behind. And with that final truth, I turned toward the sunrise, and walked forward, never looking back.